The call came on a Sunday evening in October, right in the middle of a football game I had no real interest in watching. My son's voice on the other end was different, lighter, almost giddy in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager who'd just gotten his driver's license. He said he had someone he wanted me to meet. He said he thought she might be the one. I remember setting down my glass of sweet tea and staring at the muted television for a long moment before I answered him. "Bring her to dinner," I said. "Let's see." That was 11 months ago. Last week, I sat in a federal courtroom in Atlanta and watched a woman named Vivian Colt receive a sentencing recommendation of 4 to 6 years for extortion, fraud, and filing a false police report. My son Daniel sat beside me. He didn't say a word the entire time. When it was over, he reached over and put his hand on my arm, and I understood that to mean everything that neither of us had the words for. But I should go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a commercial real estate development company from a single strip mall in Marietta, Georgia, into a portfolio that now spans 7 states. I am not a man who talks about money easily or often. My father raised me to believe that discussing your finances in polite company was about as tasteful as discussing your medical history at a dinner table. So I won't give you numbers. What I will say is that by the time Daniel was grown, he had never wanted for anything, and he knew it. And I sometimes wonder if that was the first mistake I made in all of this. Daniel is 34. He's a good man, genuinely good, not just well-mannered. He works in corporate finance. He coaches youth baseball on Saturday mornings. He calls me every Sunday evening, which is exactly what he was doing the night he told me about Vivian. He met her at a charity gala for a children's hospital foundation downtown. She'd been seated at the same table. She was, by his description, the most interesting woman he'd ever spoken to in his life. I've heard those words before. Most fathers of sons have. I told him to bring her to dinner, and 2 weeks later, he did. She arrived at my home on a Saturday afternoon in late September. The weather had just turned that particular Atlanta autumn, where the heat finally breaks and the air smells like leaves and possibility. She came in wearing a cream-colored dress that struck me immediately as something chosen very deliberately. Not too formal, not too casual, just precisely calibrated to make a good impression on a father of a certain age and background. Her hair was dark and pulled back loosely. She smiled the way people smile when they've practiced smiling, which is to say it reached her eyes perfectly, which is the first thing that made me pay attention. Vivienne was 30 years old. She told me over dinner that she was a lifestyle content creator, what most people of my generation simply call an influencer. Though she bristled slightly at that word and offered the longer title instead. She had, she said, around 400,000 followers across her platforms. She talked about brand partnerships and creative direction and audience engagement with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed these explanations many times. Daniel watched her the way young men watch women they're falling for, with that particular unfocused admiration that looks a lot like listening but isn't quite the same thing. I watched her differently. I noticed that within the first 40 minutes of dinner, she had asked me, in various indirect ways, 4 separate questions about the nature and structure of my business. Not about what I built or what I was proud of, about ownership percentages, about whether I operated through LLCs or a parent holding company, about whether Daniel had any formal role in the organization. She wrapped each question in a compliment or a laugh, the way you wrap a pill in peanut butter for a dog. But I caught every one of them. After dessert, when Daniel stepped away from the table, she leaned forward slightly and said, with a warmth that I had to admit was skillfully deployed, "He talks about you constantly, you know. You're obviously the person he respects most in the world. That means everything to me." I thanked her and smiled and said nothing of substance. That night, after they left, I sat in my study for a long time. I couldn't have told you precisely what was wrong. It was more of a frequency, something I'd learned to hear over 30 years of deal-making and negotiation. A specific pitch in a person's behavior that told you they were optimizing for an outcome they hadn't disclosed. I'd felt it across conference tables dozens of times. I'd felt it when junior partners came to me with proposals that were really about something else entirely. I recognized it. I just hadn't expected to feel it at my own dinner table, directed at my son. I did what I've always done. When something requires clarity, I made some calls. I want to be precise here, because I know how this sounds. I am not a man who investigates the personal history of everyone my son dates. Daniel is 34 years old and fully capable of making his own choices. But I have also spent my entire career in an industry where due diligence is not a sign of distrust, it's a sign of respect for what's at stake. And what was at stake here was my son. I reached out to a former colleague who now runs a private investigative firm in Buckhead. We'd done background work together before on business partners, and I trusted his discretion completely. I gave him Vivian's full name, her approximate age, the name of the content platforms she'd mentioned. I told him I wanted to understand who she was before she became a more permanent part of my family's life. What he came back with 3 weeks later was not what I expected. Vivian Colt had a history. Not a criminal history, at least not one that had resulted in charges, but a pattern that was, in its way, more revealing than a single arrest record. In the past 8 years, she had been in serious relationships with 3 different men, all of them substantially older, all of them financially successful. In 2 of those cases, the relationships had ended with the men making significant financial transfers to her. One framed as a loan that was never repaid, one structured as an investment in a content business that dissolved within months of the transfer. The third relationship had ended abruptly after the man, a semi-retired contractor in Chattanooga, had refused a request she made that he described, in a brief conversation with my investigator, as a demand, not a request. He would not elaborate further. In between these relationships, she had been evicted twice from apartments in Atlanta and once from a short-term rental in Nashville. Her online presence, which projected a life of boutique hotels and curated aesthetics and wellness retreats, was financed almost entirely by the transfers she received from these men. The brand partnerships were real but modest, nowhere near sufficient to sustain the lifestyle she displayed publicly. She wasn't a lifestyle creator. She was a woman who had figured out how to use the performance of a lifestyle to attract men who could fund it. I sat with that information for several days. I considered telling Daniel directly. I rehearsed the conversation in my head a dozen times. But here's the thing about telling a man in love that the woman he loves is not who she appears to be. He doesn't hear you. Not really. What he hears is that you don't believe in his judgment. What he hears is that you think he's naive. And the more certain you are, the more he digs in, because accepting what you're saying requires him to accept a humiliation he's not yet ready for. I'd watched this happen with friends' children. I'd watched fathers deliver exactly the right information at exactly the wrong moment and lose their sons for years over it. So I waited. I watched. And I made sure I was prepared. I told my assistant to make a note in my calendar. Any meeting or call I had with Vivienne going forward, I would carry my personal recording device. Georgia is a one-party consent state. I was not breaking any law. I was simply ensuring that if a moment came, and I believed a moment would come, I would have what I needed. The moment I didn't anticipate came from a direction I hadn't fully planned for. Daniel proposed to Vivienne in December. A restaurant in Midtown, a ring that had belonged to his mother, candles, the whole production. She said yes, naturally. She posted about it that same night, a photograph of her hand, the ring catching the light, a caption about finding her person. It received 40,000 likes by morning. I called him to congratulate him. I told him I loved him. I meant both things completely and simultaneously, held in mind that I was watching a man I loved walk towards something I believed would hurt him badly. That is one of the more difficult emotional positions a father can occupy. The engagement party was planned for April. Vivienne took charge of the arrangements almost immediately, which I noted. She selected a private event venue in Virginia Highland, a restored industrial space that rented for more per evening than most people's monthly mortgage payments. She put together a guest list of around 90 people. She hired a photographer, a videographer, a florist whose work I had seen at corporate galas downtown. Everything about it was calibrated to a level of extravagance that, when I reviewed the preliminary budget she'd shared with Daniel, made me very quietly concerned. Daniel mentioned, almost in passing, that Vivienne had asked whether I might be willing to contribute to the cost of the event, given the scale of what she had in mind. He said it in the way sons say things, when they've been asked to ask something they're not entirely comfortable asking. I told him I'd think about it. I transferred a reasonable amount to his account and said nothing further about the budget. The party was scheduled for a Saturday evening. The week before, Vivienne called me directly. This was unusual in the months since the dinner at my house. We had spoken perhaps 4 or 5 times by phone, always briefly, always about logistics relating to Daniel. This call was different. She said she'd love to get together for coffee before the party, just the two of us, to talk about the future. She said she wanted us to have a real relationship, not just coexisting at family gatherings, but genuinely knowing each other. She said she thought it would mean so much to Daniel. I agreed. I suggested we meet at a cafe near my office the following Thursday, and before I went to sleep that night, I put fresh batteries in my recording device. We met at 11 in the morning. She was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with a coffee she'd clearly ordered some time ago. She looked, as she always did, precisely assembled. She smiled when she saw me, stood to greet me, and we exchanged the pleasantries that two people exchange when they are performing a relationship that doesn't yet fully exist. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation was easy enough. She asked about the business. She talked about her plans for her content work after the wedding, how she wanted to pivot toward a more lifestyle and family focus, how she thought that demographic would be more monetizable long-term. She mentioned, twice, that she thought Daniel was in a position to do extraordinary things if he had the right support structure around him. Each time she said something like that, she held my eyes a moment longer than necessary, the way people do when they want you to understand they're saying 2 things at once. Then, she said she wanted to talk to me about something sensitive. I told her to go ahead. She said that before the engagement party, she wanted to resolve a concern she'd been carrying for several months. She said it was difficult to bring up, but that she cared about honesty too much to let it sit. She said that on an evening in January, when she had stopped by my office building to surprise Daniel, she had encountered a situation that had disturbed her deeply. She had run into me in the parking garage, she said. She claimed that I had behaved toward her in a way that she could only describe as threatening and inappropriate. She used the word assault. The word landed on the table between us like something dropped from a great height. I looked at her for a moment, without speaking. She said she hadn't told Daniel because she didn't want to cause him pain. She said she hadn't told anyone because she wanted to handle it privately, between the two of us. She said she understood that these things were complicated, and that she had no desire to pursue any formal action. All she wanted, she said, was for us to reach an agreement that reflected the seriousness of what had happened and the importance of protecting Daniel from unnecessary hurt. She placed her hands flat on the table in front of her. She said the number out loud. $1.8 million, transferred to an account she would provide within 30 days of the wedding. The cafe was playing something low and instrumental in the background. A man 2 tables over was typing on a laptop. Through the window, I could see traffic moving normally down the street, all the ordinary Friday morning business of the city, continuing without any awareness of what was happening at this corner table. I looked at Vivienne Colt, and I felt, more than anything else, a profound and clarifying calm. I said, "I need to make sure I understand you correctly. You're telling me that unless I transfer $1.8 million to an account of your choosing, you'll accuse me of assaulting you in a parking garage." She started to reframe it, to wrap it in the language of agreements and privacy and protecting family. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and placed my recording device on the table between us, face up, the small red indicator light still glowing. Her sentence stopped in the middle of a word. I told her that the device had been recording since before she sat down. I told her that this was, in the state of Georgia, entirely legal. I told her I had a meeting that afternoon with my attorney and that I would be playing him the recording at that time. I told her that I had additionally, over the past several months, compiled a detailed account of her financial history, her previous relationships, and the pattern of behavior that preceded each of them. I picked up my coffee. I told her that if she genuinely had an accusation to make, she was welcome to make it, and that I would answer it with everything I'd described, in whatever courtroom or administrative proceeding she chose. I told her that if she chose not to pursue that path, she might want to think carefully about her next several decisions. Then I thanked her for the coffee and I stood up and I left. I drove directly to my attorney's office. He listened to the recording twice. He said very little during the first listen. During the second, he took notes. When it finished the second time, he sat back in his chair and looked at me for a moment and said, "You've been carrying this around for how long?" I told him, "Several months." He shook his head slowly, not in disapproval, more in the way that men of a certain age shake their heads when something confirms a thing they already knew about the world. We filed a report with the Atlanta Police Department that afternoon. Accompanied by the full recording, my investigators compiled research, and a written statement from the man in Chattanooga, whom my investigator had contacted again with a specific request to document what he'd experienced. He had agreed to provide a formal statement. The engagement party happened anyway. It happened because I made a decision, after a long conversation with my attorney and a longer conversation with myself, that telling Daniel before the party would be a mistake. What I needed him to see, when the time came, was not my word against Vivienne's. What I needed him to see was evidence complete, documented, undeniable, so that the moment of understanding would be his own, not something I handed to him that he had to choose to accept. The party was beautiful, in the way that things planned by people with strong aesthetic instincts and no restraint on spending tend to be beautiful. I stood in that restored brick space in Virginia Highland and watched my son be happy in the way that only people who don't yet know what's coming are happy, and it was one of the harder evenings of my life. Vivienne circulated through the room. She was exceptional at it, warm, engaged, specific in her conversations, the kind of guest who makes everyone feel individually noticed. I watched her work the room, and I thought about the 400,000 people who watched her platforms and believed they were seeing a true and unmediated person. And I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite sadness, but something in between. She avoided me for most of the evening. When we were unavoidably in proximity, she smiled at me with the particular fixed quality of a person who is working very hard to perform normalcy and finding it expensive. 2 weeks after the party, Daniel called me on a Sunday evening at his usual time. His voice was different in a way I recognized from our conversation 11 months before, but in reverse, heavier, quieter, as though he was carrying something he wasn't sure yet how to put down. He said a detective had called him. He said there was an investigation involving Vivienne. He said he didn't understand what was happening, and he needed me to tell him what I knew. I told him I would come over. I sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours that night. I told him everything from the first dinner, to my investigator, to the cafe, to the recording, to the report I'd filed. I laid out the documents my investigator had compiled. I played him the recording. He didn't say anything for a very long time after it ended. I didn't try to fill the silence. I'd learned enough by then to understand that some silences need to be allowed their full weight before anything useful can be built on them. Finally, he said, she told me that she had a difficult relationship with her dad, that he was controlling, that she'd spent most of her adult life rebuilding after him. I told him I understood why that story would resonate. I told him I thought it was probably the story she'd learned to tell, because it was the one that generated the most sympathy and the most willingness to give her the benefit of every doubt. He put his face in his hands, not crying, just holding something. I told him that none of this was a reflection of his judgment or his worth. I told him that what Vivienne did was specifically designed to bypass the instincts of good people. I told him that being fooled by someone very skilled at fooling people was not the same as being a fool. He looked up after a while and said, "Did you know? From the beginning?" I told him I didn't know. I told him I felt something that required me to pay closer attention. I told him there was a difference. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're integrating something difficult. The investigation moved relatively quickly, given the quality of the evidence. The recording was central. The Chattanooga statement corroborated the pattern. 2 of the 3 previous men she had been involved with ultimately provided documentation to investigators. The extortion charge was the primary count. The false report charge came from a detailed inquiry into her January claim, which surveillance footage from my office building's parking garage definitively disproved I had not been in that garage at any point on the evening she described. The fraud counts, related to representations she had made to a brand partner using fabricated engagement metrics. Vivian's attorney argued that the recording had been obtained in a coercive context. The judge disagreed. She pleaded guilty to the extortion count and 2 of the fraud counts in a negotiated arrangement. The sentencing hearing was last week. 4 to 6 years, with the lower end likely depending on conduct during the period of supervision. Her attorney made a statement. Vivian looked at the floor. Daniel and I drove home afterward in separate cars. He texted me when he got to his apartment. He said thank you, and then he said something I've thought about every day since. He said, I keep trying to figure out when I should have seen it, and I think the honest answer is that I didn't want to. I wanted it to be real, more than I wanted to know the truth. I texted back that I thought that was one of the most honest things I'd ever heard him say. I told him that wanting something to be real was not a character flaw. I told him that the capacity to love someone wholeheartedly was worth protecting, not discarding, and that what he needed to do was carry this experience with him without letting it close him off. He sent back a single word. Okay. I'm telling this story because I've spent a lot of time thinking about what the right moment to intervene looks like. I don't know that I got it right. I waited when part of me wanted to act. I stayed quiet when part of me wanted to speak. I watched my son walk toward a painful thing because I believed the pain of discovering it on his own terms would be survivable in a way that having it removed from him would not be. Maybe I was wrong about that. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that the preparation mattered. The recording device that I carried to every conversation I had with that woman was not a product of paranoia. It was a product of attention. 30 years of building things taught me that the moments you can't undo are the ones you fail to prepare for. I prepared, and when the moment came, I had what I needed. I also know that wealth makes you a target in ways that aren't always visible until they are. I don't say that with bitterness or self-pity. I say it as plainly as I can because I think it's important. The people in your life who know the size of what you've built are not always the people who wish you well. Some of them are people who have made a careful study of you and your family and are waiting patiently for the access point. The access point in my case was my son. It could just as easily be a sibling, a trusted employee, an old friend who finds you again after a long absence. Pay attention. Not with suspicion, with attention. There is a difference. Daniel is doing well. He started working with a therapist in November, which I consider one of the better decisions he's made. He still coaches youth baseball on Saturday mornings. He still calls me on Sunday evenings. The calls are a little longer now, a little less surface. Last Sunday, he talked for 20 minutes about a kid on his team who'd had a rough home situation and was starting to come out of himself a little. He sounded, while he was telling me that story, exactly like the man I raised him to be. Some things survive what they go through. When they do, they come out stronger on the other side, in ways that weren't available to them before. I believe that about buildings. I believe it about families. I believe it about sons. If you've watched this far, I suspect you have someone in your life you're worried about. Someone who's moving toward something and can't quite see it yet. I can't tell you when to speak and when to wait. I'm not sure anyone can tell you that. What I can tell you is to prepare, document, know the laws in your state, find people you trust with the real information. And when the moment comes, make sure you have what you need. You only get one chance to be the person who was ready.